Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man! We come now to the adjournment. The whip to move.
I beg to move that this House do now adjourn.
Thank you. The question is that this House do now adjourn. Mr. Chuka Umunna.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the 23rd of June, our country voted to leave the European Union. It was not a landslide result. 48% voted to remain, 52% voted to leave. London, Scotland and Northern Ireland voted to remain. The majority of England and Wales voted to leave. The young overwhelmingly voted to stay. Older voters opted to leave. Socioeconomic classes and different ethnic groups voted in different ways too. I was immensely proud to play a leading role in the Labour in for Britain and Britain Stronger in Europe campaigns during the EU referendum because, Mr. Speaker, to my core, I still believe that by the strength of our common endeavour, we achieve more together than we do alone, not only as individuals, but as nation states as we seek to amplify Britain's role in the world and achieve as much for our community of nations around the world as possible. However, I accept the result. Before the vote, Remain campaigners accepted the rules under which the referendum was fought, and I don't think that having had a referendum conducted under those rules which we debated in this House, we can now reject them because we do not like the outcome. Either you are a Democrat or not, Mr. Speaker, and I am a Democrat. Various promises were made by each side in that referendum campaign. Now it is over. It is important that we hold the winning side to account for the policies and claims that were made and upon which people voted. I say hold to account deliberately. We would not want all of the Vote Leave campaign's promises to be delivered on the Remain side. But it is right and proper, for the sake of our shared values of democracy, accountability and transparency, the foundations upon which this House is built, that Vote Leave campaigners who are members of this House should now be tested on whether they deliver what they pledged to the people, and if they do not, they should explain why not to their constituents and the nation in this House. Hear, hear. Thousands of people agree and have joined the Vote Leave Watch campaign that I chair. I've stated this in the relevant declaration in the Register of Members' Interests because they care about this too. Now, one promise that was made, which the overwhelming majority of people, both the 16 million who voted to remain and the 17 million odd who voted to leave, would want to see kept, was the pledge that the Vote Leave campaign made to put £350 million extra per week into the NHS. It was the key pledge of the Vote Leave campaign. Prominent members of the government, the Foreign, Environment, International Development, International Trade and Transport Secretaries, all members of the current cabinet, went around the country in a big red bus that said, and I quote, "We send the EU £350 million a week, let's fund our NHS instead." Or they gave speeches in front of a sign saying, and I quote, "Let's give our NHS the £350 million the EU takes every week." None of them disowned this pledge during the campaign, not a single one. The clear message they sought to give to the people was that if we leave the EU, £350 million a week extra will be put into our NHS, our National Health Service. There was no qualification given to that pledge. I give way to my honourable friend.
Thank my honourable friend for giving way. He's making such a powerful case because it's such a powerful point within our economy. We have all know that in my part of London with the Barts Trust, which has the largest overspend predicted in NHS history. So does he agree with me? It's absolutely vital that those who campaigned and pledged that this would happen are held to account as a result, because communities like mine are suffering without investment in the NHS.
Absolutely, I agree with my honourable friend, and had the pleasure of being in her constituency the other week and could see this for myself. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
Grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. He's absolutely right to say that the £350 million a week for the NHS claim was at the centre of Vote Leave's campaign. And they were given a number of opportunities to revise the claim, to qualify the claim, to disown the claim, including quite strident criticism from the Treasury Select Committee, all members of the Treasury Select Committee, whether Remainers or Leavers. The fact they chose not to distance themselves from this claim surely demonstrates that this was a promise that ought to be delivered on, and if not, they've got some explaining to do.
I completely agree with my honourable friend, and as he says, for the record, it is significant that the Treasury Select Committee has come to that conclusion. It is a cross-party committee. It contains Leavers and Remainers. Now, we know the NHS, as my honourable friend from Walthamstow has said, we know the NHS needs the extra cash. The Minister will know this. As members of the Health Select Committee pointed out last month, the deficit in NHS trusts and foundation trusts in 2015-16 was over 3.5 billion. Claimed, I give way to my honourable friend.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. He's making a very powerful argument for extra NHS funding. But does he share my concern that actually our NHS could be worse off as a result of the decision to leave the EU, with the reduction in our exchange rate, meaning that the purchase of products from abroad is going to be more expensive? And does he share my concern that when I asked the Secretary of State for Health how much and what proportion of total NHS budget was spent on imports, they were unaware and unable to give me that information?
Well, that is absolutely outrageous that the ministers were unable to give my honourable friend those figures, because we know that ministers themselves have exacerbated the knock-on impact on the economy of the depreciation in value of the pound. It depreciated in value by 6% before October, and then depreciated in value a further 15% because of uncertainty around our trading arrangements, triggered by comments and contradictory remarks made by the International Trade Secretary, which were different to those that had been made by the Chancellor to the Treasury Select Committee and other forums. And the knock-on impact isn't just on household budgets, as the cost of things increase. Of course, the NHS is going to take a big hit from that. And of course, public services in general, if we see growth reduce and exchequer receipts fall, is going to be affected. Claimed increases that no doubt the Minister may mention in NHS funding by ministers are actually been funded by reductions in other areas of health spending that fall outside the NHS England's budget. Reductions in spending on social care are having a serious impact on the NHS, translating to increased A&E attendances, emergency admissions, and delays to people leaving hospital. Now, I've mentioned select committees and what ministers and members of Parliament are saying about this, but there are third parties. The King's Fund, the Nuffield Trust, and the Health Foundation are clear. Current government spending plans through to 2019-2020 will not be enough, they say, to maintain standards of care, meet rising demand from patients, and deliver the transformation in services outlined in the NHS 5-year forward review. So myself and over 40 members of this House, including all of my honourable friends here on this side today, of different parties, have written to the Chancellor asking that when he presents his first autumn statement on the 23rd of November, he sets out how he will put the government on a path to increasing national NHS spending by that promised £350 million extra a week once we have left the European Union. This additional funding, to be clear, must be over and above the amount that is currently planned to be spent on the National Health Service. The BMA has also made the same demand. I'll give way to the Honourable Lady.
To my honourable friend for giving way. Is he saying that the government has to honour a promise made by others to the tune of £350 million a week extra for the NHS? Because could I say to him that certainly the honourable gentleman who represents North East Somerset and indeed other notable leavers have now conceded that the actual figure was 120 million. And would it also not be very unfair to say that the government has to deliver it when actually the government never made any such promise to the British people?
I'm grateful for the Right Honourable Lady's intervention, and I will come to those precise points very shortly, but I do note the public statements she herself made when she was a member of the government, criticising the way in which her fellow ministerial colleagues were going around making these big promises on her behalf, perhaps, as fellow ministers. But I will come on to that point. I'll give way to the Honourable Lady.
I think you have to be very clear about this. During the election, the EU referendum, we campaigned individually, not on behalf of the government, as ministers. And the honourable gentleman is right. There were some ministers who went out and campaigned for leave and no doubt made this and indeed many other promises, which I don't think they'll be able to deliver on. There was a real distinction to be made between the promises of government and those who happen now to be in government. It's really the leave campaign that must be held to account, not the government.
I will come on to that precise point because she preempts what I'm about to say. What I want from the Minister today, to be clear, I want, from his department's point of view, him to give the same commitment that we are asking the Treasury to give and outline how his department will make good on this pledge. And I will explain why I believe that this is a pledge that this government should deliver. Now, there are a number of reasons the Minister may give, echoing perhaps the honourable member whose constituency I apologise for forgetting, may give, as to why the promise given by his ministerial colleagues at the time should not be treated as such. And I will deal with each of the main claims in that regard in turn. And they've already been touched on by the honourable lady. First, there are those who claim that this was not a pledge at all. Nigel Farage, the interim leader of the UK Independence Party, said that it was one of the mistakes that he thought the Leave campaign made. The Transport Secretary in position now, who was also in the government at the time, has said that the specific proposal made by the Vote Leave campaign was in fact to spend £100 million a week of the £350 million on the NHS that he had hoped. Now, he said that that would be an aspiration which will be met. Well, I say to the Transport Secretary, the poster they all stood next to did not say that this was an aspiration. It was a pledge, pure and simple. There was no qualification given in the poster or on that big red bus. It was a statement that was made, and they should now be held to account for it. Secondly, many Leave campaigners deny ever using that £350 million figure. One of them here has said, I always referred to Britain's net contribution of nearly 10 billion, some £200 million a week. Some of them say this, rather than that £350 million figure. It is true. And the honourable member for Walthamstow has touched on this, Ilford North has touched on this. The Office for National Statistics did say that that £350 million figure was misleading. But the head of the Vote Leave campaign said, and I quote, the £350 million figure is correct and we stand by it. Vote Leave, whose banner government ministers campaigned under, carried on using it, as the member for Ilford North said, and those ministers must now be held to account. I'll give way to my own friend.
I thank you, going back. I take my lead, sadly, from the member for Uxbridge, who doesn't appear to be here, but was one of the prominent members of the Vote Leave campaign and has said that Brexit must give the NHS a boost. In my part of town, a boost to the NHS is the vital funding needed to get our NHS back on track. Does he agree with me that we should listen to the member for Uxbridge on that point?
Well, I will come to him very shortly, because the other thing that they say is that, and I think it's been touched on, not all the people who made these pledges were members of the then Conservative government. And you could perhaps say that about the member for Uxbridge. Well, of the 5 current members of the Cabinet I've mentioned, 3 were members of the government, and 1, the member for Uxbridge, attended the political cabinet at the time. And yes, the now International Trade Secretary was sitting on the back benches, but countless other ministers outside of the cabinet at the time and serving now more than make up for this. You have the members for Portsmouth, Camborne and Redruth, Stockton South, I could go on, just to mention a few of these people who stood and posed by those posters and next to that big red bus. They have got to be held to account. Now finally, and this is a crux of the argument that the Honourable Lady raised, they say it was a commitment given by one side in a referendum campaign and not by a government. I'm sorry, this will simply not wash. The primary reason why many of these campaigners were put up to do media and campaign on Vote Leave's behalf was precisely because they carried the authority of being government ministers. That's why they were used. That's why they were asked to stand by that red bus, to stand by those posters. It was because they carried the authority of being government ministers. And all of those key Vote Leave campaigners, whether they were ministers or not, were members of this House. And if our democracy is to mean anything, it is that you are answerable to the electorate for your policies and you are held to account in this House for the things that you say. You cannot go around this country casually promising the world, betray people by failing to deliver, and then expect to get away with it. We will not forget, we will not let up. It was in the name of parliamentary sovereignty that these ministers campaigned, and it is time this House, if we want to use this phrase, on behalf of the people we were elected to represent, takes back control and makes these ministers answer. I'll give way to my honourable friend.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way as being very generous with his time. Is this not just dangerous and damaging to parliamentary democracy, but also to the morale of workers in our National Health Service? I was told by the Chair and Chief Executive of my local NHS Trust, Nottingham University Hospital Trust, that they are frequently stopped by members of staff saying, when are we going to get the extra money? Are they not going to be not only incredibly disappointed, but doubly disappointed because they can see the difficulties that they're facing with huge deficit at NUH and struggling to provide the services that they know that patients require?
That's absolutely right, and I'm very grateful for all the interventions that have been made by honourable members, because the key thing is this, I say to the Minister: either they made this pledge in the expectation of delivering on it, in which case they must now show us the money, or they made this pledge to the people in the sure knowledge their promise would never be met, in which case they will never be forgiven for their betrayal of those who in good faith relied on them. Perhaps the Minister can tell us which it will be.
Minister David Mowat.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I congratulate the member for Streatham on his obtaining this debate and on the points that he made. I start by saying that, like him, I voted and campaigned for the Remain side, and like him, I accept the result, and I'm part of a government now that is responsible for delivering what was democratically decided by the British people. I think at the outset, though, I want to say that I am speaking today for the government. I am not speaking for the Leave campaign. So to the extent that he may be in the wrong debate, I apologise in advance for that, but I am going to address some of the points that were made in terms of the impact of Brexit on the NHS, because there were some valid points made on staff morale, level of funding, exchange rate. All of these things are variables, and I think it's good that we spend a bit of time this evening talking about that. I will also talk about where I guess we are in on the pledge in terms of the amount of money that we will no longer be giving to the EU when we leave, although, as he will be aware, that depends how we leave and the nature of the agreement that we eventually reach. But let's agree, first of all, on one thing, that the single most important thing that the NHS needs in order to be properly funded is a strong economy. And to the extent that Brexit may have positives and negatives on that, that is relevant. But the NHS is properly funded at the moment, and we heard some stuff about budgets and all of the rest of it. I just tell the honourable, or the right honourable member, that OECD published a analysis of NHS and social care spend for every country in the OECD. We are above average. That hasn't always been the case. We are now above average. We are possibly 1% lower than the best of class, including France and Germany. That's a gap. This was in 2014. That's a gap that is likely to have been filled because this year we gave an increase to NHS spending of 3 times the rate of inflation. And we have pledged that the NHS budget will increase in real terms. NHS England's budget will increase in real terms by £10 billion between now and 2021. I do not believe that Brexit will make any difference to that, and indeed it's a commitment and a priority of this government that it won't. We do know, though, Mr. Speaker, that there's issues in how that money is allocated within the NHS, because I think we are broadly at the average point of the OECD. We do, and we could spend that money more efficiently and more effectively. We could frankly spend more money on primary care than we do. We could spend more money on cancer, mental health than we do, and those are government priorities. And the SDP process, we hope, will help to deliver that, because at the moment we do spend too much on acute care. And of course there's efficiencies that we can find. Agency staffing is too high, we need to address that. There's a lot we can do on procurement, Carter, new care models and all that go with that. But all of that we need to... Certainly, yeah.
On that point, what he could also do is work to renegotiate the PFI loans that are crippling our NHS, and also not use PF2 to do that. In order to do that, we need money in the NHS to be able to renegotiate. Surely the 350 million would help get us to that place. It would help us renegotiate our debt, get our members back into work, and also get our NHS fit for purpose for the 21st century.
And Mr. Speaker, nobody in this House would be more pleased than I if we did not have the PFI millstone round our neck. The PFI the Honourable Lady talks of renegotiation. This is real money, real contracts that were signed more or less entirely by the last government, There is no magic wand that we can just set those PFI contracts aside. That is not how the commercial world works. I wish there was, certainly.
I'm grateful to the Minister for giving way, but I'm sure he will be aware that the £10 billion figure he has just cited in terms of extra increased funding is one that is rejected by the cross-party Health Select Committee. And the second point I just made to him, it's all very well referring to what he alleges are increases in funding to the NHS, but the other cuts that his government have made over the last 5 to 6 years, in particular to local authority budgets, have put huge pressure on social care, which has led to a knock-on impact on the NHS and an impact on its funding.
You mentioned social care, and that is fair, because social care is funded separately to the NHS, and those budgets are separate. I just make this point to him, that during the course of this Parliament, the social care budget will increase in real terms. I do accept that the social care system is under pressure, but I also make this point to him, that there is a massive disparity in performance in social care between councils. And if you like, the top 10% of councils in terms of delayed transfers of care and DTOC and all of the rest of it are something like 20 to 25 times better at it in terms of outcomes in delayed transfers of care than the bottom 10%. There's a lot of facets to this, but I accept the basic point, and we all accept the point, I think, on both sides, that all other things being equal, we would like the NHS to have more money. I mean, let's agree on that and see how we make progress on it. Now, the issues that Brexit seems to me give us are as follows. I mean, there's a number of variables, frankly, that Brexit introduced that may not have been there before. What is the impact of Brexit going to be on our economy? Our GDP in 3-4 years could be higher, could be lower because of Brexit. The truth is, neither he nor I know the answer to that, and there's different views. They may not be here today, but there's different views in this House upon what the answer to that is. But it's important and it's relevant, because if the economy were to have a significant difficulty, that would potentially impact spending commitments. So there's the economy. I'll make a little bit of progress and then I will give way again. The second variable, which I think is a very substantive area, and it was mentioned earlier, is that of exchange rate. Our exchange rate went down something like 15%. Principally, it would seem reasonable to say, as a consequence of Brexit. That is a good and a bad thing for the economy. Many countries in the world are trying to get their exchange rate down. I'm an MP in the north of our country. We have a more manufacturing-based economy there. Frankly, a lower exchange rate will help that economy there. That may not be the case in other parts and in the city. But the exchange rate has got an impact on the NHS. Two impacts, in fact, I think. One, the one that the Honourable Lady mentioned, which was that it will be more expensive to import scanners, be more expensive to potentially import drugs, and there is an effect on that. She asked what the figure was. I also can't give her an exact figure. My understanding, it's considerably less than 5% of the total NHS expenditure of around about 100 billion. But nevertheless, it's a relevant factor, and it makes a difference. The other impact of the exchange rate, which she didn't mention, is it will impact the attractiveness of the UK economy in general, and the NHS in particular, in terms of overseas workers. Because if you're coming in from the EU to work in our economy, and the exchange rate is 15% lower than it was a year ago, you're earning 15% less in your home currency. And there will be an impact on the margin in terms of staffing of that, and that's an issue that we need to manage. The third variable is the one that we spent so much time talking about, which is the payment that we make to the EU. And I'm not going to get bogged down in the numbers around this, but from my point of view, we pay the EU something like £20 billion a year. Roughly speaking, we get 10 billion of that back, which creates a bonus. Now, in theory, when we leave the EU, and in terms of his letter that he mentioned, I mean, in all fairness, even if this bonus was to materialise, which I expect it to happen, it will not materialise until after we've left the EU. So writing to the Chancellor now strikes me as potentially a symbolic letter, but please carry on.
To be absolutely clear to the Minister, what the ask was that the Chancellor sets out the path for achieving this after we have left. And I want to ask him two questions. One, would he say, given his comments on this being, in his view, not a pledge of the government but of a campaign, that it was wrong for people to go around giving the impression that they would dish out this money? And secondly, just for the record, can we be clear, is he saying that this government will not meet it?
Mr. Speaker, just for the record, I'm not saying this government will not meet it. All I can say is this government has yet to decide how it will spend any bonus that comes from any rebate that we get, which will all depend on the precise negotiations that take place, the precise type of exit that we have from Brexit, and nobody in this chamber know the answer to that. For example, we could leave and we could have a Norwegian type deal, which for example does entail paying money or may entail paying money. Now, I am not a member of the Brexit department. I do not know where the current thinking is on that, but of course it's a variable. Yes, okay.
Well, given what he's saying, would he therefore say it was wrong to go around giving the impression that all we needed to do was vote to leave the European Union and £350 million extra a week would be dished out to the NHS?
Mr. Speaker, had I been writing something on the side of the bus and had I been campaigning on that side of the referendum, I might have been more circumspect and said that potentially 350 million will be available and could be spent in terms of whatever the government's priorities are, one of which is very likely to be the NHS. I hope that satisfies him. Let me continue. Yeah.
I regret that I seem to have stumbled into a sort of elongated primal scream, a therapy session refighting last June's referendum. The fact of the matter is that the honourable gentleman would have a more persuasive and cogent argument if he saw the other side of the equation, which is, yes, EU workers have a massive impact and are committed to the NHS, but also unrestricted EU migration over a period of a number of years has put massive strains on the delivery of health services, which he is not and has never conceded.
Let me make progress, Mr. Speaker, in terms of this adjournment debate, although I do understand I have until 7:30. We mentioned the payment to the EU. There's also the point about staff, and the other thing that we haven't mentioned, and I'll mention it for completeness, there's an impact on in EU institutions. The European Medicines Agency is located in London. That's of benefit to our pharmaceuticals industry. It should be an issue for the people that are negotiating this deal as to how that ends up, because there's a potential impact of that. And from my point of view, too often we talk about the conditions around the EU, all around the City of London and passporting and all that goes with that, and frankly not enough about other world-class industries, one of which is pharmaceuticals. So I hope those responsible will listen to that. So, Mr. Speaker, we've talked about the economy, which is a big variable, and frankly, neither of us know whether or not the economy will be better or worse as a consequence of leaving the EU. But it is true that the exchange rate coming down by 15% is helping manufacturing organisations in the north of this country, will have an effect on GDP, but will also have some effect on the imports that we have in terms of things like scanners and accelerators and drugs. I guess, though, I want to talk a little bit about staffing. The NHS is hugely reliant on staff from the European Union. 58,000 people work in the NHS from EU countries. 90,000 people work in social care from EU countries. And I want to take the opportunity today to reiterate the government's position that we understand that massive contribution, and we know that it's important to our NHS that contribution continues. The Secretary of State said exactly that to the Select Committee, the Health Select Committee, and the Prime Minister herself has made the phrase that she hopes and expects citizens from the EU in our vital services to stay. I would like, and maybe he can help in terms of the group that he's speaking for today. I would like that some of our EU colleagues and friends would make a similar commitment about our own country people who are working in EU countries at the moment, which has not yet happened.
I speak for my constituents above all else whenever I speak on these issues in this House. And on that specific point, can he explain to me why the government simply does not guarantee the right of those EU citizens working in our health service to stay here, given, and I understand the demand for the reciprocal right to be given to UK citizens living in other EU countries, but they shouldn't be used as a bargaining chip. And the Immigration Minister, when he appeared before the Home Affairs Select Committee, has admitted that we do not know where most of the EU citizens are in this country or who they are. So if we weren't to deliver on the promise to guarantee them the right to stay here, we have no way of removing them because we don't know where they are, who they are.
Mr. Speaker, it's not for me to make that specific guarantee. The Prime Minister has said very clearly she hopes and expects them to remain. But I make the point that it is disappointing that a similarly strong statement hasn't been made by any head of state in any other European country. Now, having said that on staffing, it is also right that we do more to train more of our own nurses and more of our own doctors, not because we need to replace people from the EU, because it's the right thing to do. We should try to become self-sufficient in these matters, and that will happen. Now, during the course of this debate, and we've knocked around this quite a lot, there's been a number of variables that we've talked about: exchange rate, GDP, the EU bonus or payment that we're going to get. There's one thing, though, that isn't a variable, and it's probably the most important single thing that is a constant, and that is the extent to which this government, gives priority to the health service in terms of its spending commitments. And that constant is absolutely clear. The previous Prime Minister treated the NHS as his number one commitment. The current Prime Minister treats the NHS as her number one commitment. Many of the points that we've discussed this evening are things that should properly form part of the negotiation that we're going to have after we trigger Article 50, hopefully by March, and I'm certain that will be the case. But what isn't negotiable is the fact that the NHS, our commitments to NHS funding and social care funding, are absolutely unmoved by any of these things. It is the number one priority for this government. And before I sit down, I will take the intervention.
Is it not the case that what might happen in the future dispensation after Brexit is that we will have a fairer system in terms of the recruitment and retention of NHS staff? All of us have staff from outside the EU. In my own constituency, Nigerian, Ghanaian and particular Filipino nursing staff, who at the moment hitherto have been discriminated against inadvertently vis-à-vis those from the European Union. And we'll have a much fairer system in reaching out and getting the brightest and the best to work in our NHS in the future.
Well, Mr. Speaker, he uses the word fair, and that's, I mean, of course we do have staff from other parts of the world. I will be honest, Mr. Speaker, and say this, that there's part of me that has some difficulty in saying that we as a country take large numbers of doctors and nurses from places like Nigeria and parts of Africa that frankly need them more than we do. So it is right that we try to train and train more of the people that we need in these vital public services, but it's also right that we make it absolutely clear how important the people that currently work in our NHS and in social care from the EU and from outside of the EU, and he reminded us of that, and that's important. And I'll make the point again, Mr. Speaker, because I won't go on until 7:30, that the National Health Service is this government's number one spending priority, and it will continue to be so.
Yeah. Order. The question is that this House do now adjourn. As many as are that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order. Order.